I struggled for a long time with surviving. No matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. We don't have to do this. You know that, right?
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
I'm sorry.
The Last of Us is considered by a lot of people to be one of the greatest games ever made. It got great reviews at release and it ended up winning over 200 Game of the Year awards. It's a game so well received that it managed to get a remaster, a remake, a sequel, and now a show for HBO, all within the span of a decade. The biggest reason for why this game is so well liked is its story. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people who enjoy The Last of Us's gameplay, but let's be honest, The Last of Us didn't really become popular because of its gameplay. It became popular because of its story. So many gamers felt that The Last of Us' story was extremely mature, emotional, and powerful. It resonated with a lot of gamers in a way that few video game stories ever did. It's no wonder that some people have said that The Last of Us has the best video game story ever. But are gamers right in saying that? I wanted to answer that question by first talking about the history of video game stories. I want to bring up some examples of video game stories that came out before The Last of Us. Then of course I want to talk about The Last of Us' story in order to really answer the question as to whether or not The Last of Us has the best video game story ever. Every point I bring up in this video is just my opinion. I'm of course not trying to say that my opinion is right or that anyone who disagrees with me is wrong. This is just my opinion. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are about The Last of Us' story, and if you enjoyed the video, liking and subscribing would really help me out. With all that being said, enjoy the video. One of the earliest video game stories that a player can see unfold in a visual way on the screen is a game called Donkey Kong. Released in 1981, the story was pretty simple. Mario has to go and rescue his girlfriend Pauline from the giant gorilla Donkey Kong. He runs, jumps on platforms, climbs ladders, and gets reunited with her at the end of every level. This simple story isn't the most interesting or engaging, but it didn't really have to be. The real appeal of Donkey Kong is the gameplay, which for most players was more than enough. There's this idea that games from the 1980s didn't have compelling stories, and that was very often true. Like, do you really need much of a story for why you're shooting ducks in a game called Duck Hunter? But some game developers during the 80s were able to use the hardware of the NES and other consoles at the time to create narratives that were engaging enough for players to get through their games. Despite lacking the ability to portray characters in the same way that a movie could, developers could immerse players using text, cinematics, music, visuals, atmosphere, and character development. All these elements and more combined in something that you could interact with made for an experience that was still captivating for players. Of course, technology was limited back then, and I would be lying if I said that narratives had reached their peak in the 1980s. What I am saying though is, in some cases, even during the NES days, games were still able to provide narratives that were satisfying.
Decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling. When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come, the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
With the transition from 8-bit consoles like the NES to 16-bit consoles like the SNES, we started to get some truly groundbreaking titles that had really remarkable stories. These stories often dealt with a lot of mature themes too. Final Fantasy VI dealt with themes like loss, human connection, and finding value in yourself. Chrono Trigger dealt with following your dreams and how you can change the world. Earthbound dealt with themes of corruption, capitalism, greed, depression, and more. Despite the fact that these were sprite-based games, they were still able to have narratives that resonated with gamers. Even though pixel art was very limiting, developers were still able to showcase sequences that had a cinematic essence to it. Look at the opening of Final Fantasy VI. Look how cinematic this sequence of the Magitech armor walking through the snow is. Part of it is the pixel art. Pixel art is simplistic and yet beautiful at the same time. It's very alluring. It gave games at the time a lot of atmosphere, and it can tell you a lot about the world the game is based in and the characters that live inside that world. Also, a lot of games in the 16-bit era had extremely moving and powerful scores. Music is such a key component in telling a good story in a visual medium like a movie or TV show, and a lot of games from this era had extremely strong music. The art, the music, and the events themselves all combined together helped to make this moment in Final Fantasy VI super effective, and I think it shows just how games from this era could be effective at storytelling even with the limitations of technology. If anything, I would argue that the limitations of technology at the time helped added to the storytelling in these games. You didn't have voice acting for most characters, you didn't have realistic looking worlds, and you didn't have characters that were highly detailed, especially in JRPGs. In a lot of games that came out during this era, you filled the gaps of what the world really looked like, what the characters truly looked like, what the characters sounded like. The beauty of this is that sometimes what you envisioned in your head could actually be better than reality. You in a way could create the story that you wanted to based off of the limited information that the games gave you. 16-bit games showed that less could be more when it came to narratives. You don't need voice acting or realistic graphics to be engaged in a story. You just need your game's story to have a heart and soul to it, and I believe a lot of the 16-bit games had that. Having recognized all of this, there is an issue though. I have a theory, and this may be wrong, but hear me out. I think that in the eyes of the average person who's either a casual gamer or someone who's not a gamer at all, 16-bit games aren't seen as a legitimate form of storytelling in their eyes because they don't remotely resemble reality. The idea that somehow you're supposed to connect to sprites seems absurd to people who aren't really into games, especially games of that era. Live action films and TV shows have real people for the most part, so it's easy to incline towards them. You don't see characters in pictureless books, but pictureless books aren't a visual medium. Games are a visual medium, so the idea of relating to a character who you can't hear the voice of, or a character who you can't see in the way that you would see an actual person, is difficult for someone who isn't an actual gamer, especially games of that era.
How do you know PlayStation is not a normal game system? It carries these telltale signs. Scientists say its effects are mind-boggling. Users lose all sense of reality and enter another world. Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation for only a few minutes. Proof that we saps must be on our guard. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
In the late 90s, we saw the transition between 2D to 3D games with the arrival of the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn. Now gaming has taken a massive leap towards becoming more realistic. Characters no longer were unrealistic looking sprites. Now you were starting to see polygon-based characters, and so you had a greater idea of what a character looked like. Games like Final Fantasy VII included pre-rendered full-motion video sequences that were able to give games a new cinematic quality to them. We started to see a lot of games get voice acting too. A lot of the voice acting from this era was, well, this.
What is this?
Stop it! Don't open that door!
What is it?
There was one game from this era though that actually had really good voice acting, and the voice acting did actually help to make the game better. Metal Gear Solid.
This is Snake. Colonel, can you hear me? Loud and clear.
Metal Gear Solid's always had some of my favorite voice acting in any game. Despite how old Metal Gear Solid is, its voice acting is still very good in my opinion, and I think the voice acting actually helps to enhance the story and the characters. Part of the reason why I personally really love Solid Snake is because of David Hayter's voice acting. He gives so much personality and charisma to Snake that otherwise wouldn't be there. Metal Gear Solid didn't just have good voice acting though, it had solid writing too, and it presented its story in a very cinematic way. Camera angles tales are framed in a similar way to a film, which, along with the impressive visuals at the time, did help to engross players in the story. It wasn't just the cinematic aspect that helped Metal Gear Solid's story be so immersive. Metal Gear Solid's gameplay helped immerse you into the story too. Some of the most impactful moments for Metal Gear Solid were boss fights where you, the player, had full control and agency. In my opinion, these moments would not have been nearly as impactful if they were just scenes from a movie or show. While the PlayStation 1 was definitely a lot more powerful than a Super Nintendo, there were still a lot of limitations with the hardware, but the limitations of the PlayStation 1 actually helped to enhance the story of Metal Gear Solid and other games from that era. In Metal Gear Solid, you only had a narrow view of the environment around you, unlike the more modern day Metal Gear games, which made Metal Gear Solid feel very claustrophobic, and the narrow view actually added to the tension of where soldiers could be. This helped add to the sense of the narrative being a technical espionage story. The 5th generation of consoles had games with really solid stories that dealt with heavily mature and real-world themes. The original Half-Life dealt with themes like free will and choice. Xenogears examined ideas from influential thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Carl Jung. Suikoden 2's story dealt with themes like war, betrayal, friendship, and hope. When I talked about the 16-bit generation of games, I talked about my theory about how the average person who isn't really a gamer, how they would view stories and games from that era as not being legitimate stories due to the games not remotely representing reality. The 5th generation of games took a step closer to reality, but even then, characters still looked super pixelated and not really lifelike. Besides Metal Gear Solid and a couple other games, the general consensus is that voice acting in games for the PS1 and N64 were less than ideal. I mentioned Final Fantasy VII cinematic pre-rendered full motion video sequences, and those sequences are great, but most of the game doesn't look like that. Featured characters that look like Lego minifigures. The issue of games not coming close to emulating reality was still very much prevalent during this era of games.
The most powerful game system now has the ultimate holiday offer. Get Tetris Worlds and Star Wars and Clone Wars, 2 months of Xbox Live and an Xbox for only what? Rated E to T. Xbox. It's good to play together.
As we got into the 6th and 7th generation of consoles, we saw video game tech and video game storytelling evolve quite a bit. So many of the limitations that hindered the ability of games to tell stories in prior generations went away. Graphics became far more realistic. I mean, look at Snake's character model. Look how much more realistic Snake looks in Metal Gear Solid 2 and 4 compared to 1. Worlds became more real and alive. They became bigger too as we saw the rise of the open world genre. In terms of how all of this can be seen in video game stories, we were able to get unique stories that previously weren't possible before to show. These stories utilize the video game medium to tell stories in a way that only games could. Shadow of the Colossus I think is a good example of this. In my opinion, it'd be really hard for a movie to capture the wonder of taking to a Colossus, or the feeling of you riding your horse. Even if movies can depict these things, it just wouldn't have the same impact as you actually doing them during gameplay. BioShock is another example of this too, because so much of BioShock's story isn't told through cutscenes, it's told through the city of Rapture and its haunting world. The mystery and beauty of Rapture is something that works so well in a game. That experience of walking through Rapture is really hard to nail in a movie. These experience type games tell stories in a unique way that works well for games, but not so much for movies or TV shows. And I think these games show just how amazing games could be at telling stories. Role-playing games that placed a heavy emphasis on player choice like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Dragon Age Origins, and the original Mass Effect trilogy managed to tell stories that were well received by a lot of gamers. Even some open world games managed to have stories that were well liked by gamers. Grand Theft Auto 4, Assassin's Creed 2, and Batman Arkham City were all games with narratives that were highly praised by gamers. The thing is though, as strong as all of the narratives in the games I've mentioned might be, they still lack the filmic essence that movies and TV shows had. Faces now were more realistic, but yet characters didn't necessarily feel like real people. And that may sound weird, because a lot of these characters are characters that gamers have grown attached to, but I do have a reason for saying all of this. Take a dialogue scene like this from Batman Arkham City.
After what happened at the asylum, I thought you'd settle for a quiet desk job.
Yeah, right. When Shark closed down the asylum, it turned out there wasn't much work for an ex-security guard who failed to stop a mass breakout. This is the only work I can get.
What happened back there wasn't your fault, Cash.
Think about how this conversation with Batman and this police officer feels a bit unnatural. Batman says his dialogue, then the police officer says his, and then it goes back and forth in a way that doesn't really feel realistic. I'm not saying every scene in Arkham City is like this. Of course not. The game is filled with cinematic cutscenes. I'm just trying to point out characters in games often didn't behave like real people, and really they still don't. A lot of video games have this issue where characters often behave somewhat robotically, and sometimes it feels as if characters are talking like they're giving you a monologue. Video game graphics did evolve considerably during the 6th and 7th generation of consoles, but yet there was always a disconnect that I think prevented games from capturing a similar feeling to what you would get from a movie or TV show. So many games had characters that, while interesting, didn't exactly feel like the characters you would see in a high quality film, where characters would be spontaneous and interact with each other in a way that's grounded and engaging. Most games during the 6th and 7th generation consoles failed at this, and most games nowadays fail at this too. There was one franchise though that actually got this part quite right, and that franchise is Uncharted. In Uncharted, dialogue and banter feel natural. Characters have wit and charisma to them without being super over the top. I think Uncharted was the prime example of a game franchise during the 7th generation of consoles that managed to capture the feeling of a film, a blockbuster film to be specific. In fact, I would argue that Uncharted was better at cinematic storytelling than most blockbuster films, because not only was it able to have characters that interacted with each other in a way that was similar to a film, it has moments you would see in a blockbuster film, except you get to actually play through those moments, which makes the moments much more impactful. Like, think about the part in Uncharted 3 where Nathan Drake is hanging on a plane. You get a really similar scene in the movie, and yet it's not nearly as impactful as Uncharted 3's scene, because Uncharted 3 gave you control, which made you feel like you were actually part of the scene.
So is that everything you hoped for?
Jury's still out. But man, can't deny that view.
Come on, this way. Hey, let's pick it up.
So why did I spend all this time talking about the evolution of video games and video game stories? Well, that's because everything I brought up is important to keep in mind when I talk about The Last of Us. I think the first thing that made The Last of Us' story stand out at the time was just how grounded everything was. While the characters in Uncharted behaved in a grounded manner, Uncharted was also very much a blockbuster action franchise. Uncharted 2 begins with Nathan Drake hanging off a train. The Last of Us begins with a father and daughter sitting on a couch and talking.
You like it?
Honey, it's
What?
nice, but I think it's stuck. It's not.
What? No. Oh, ha ha.
Uncharted was a series that had a large focus on telling a fun adventure story that includes some crazy action-packed set pieces. The Last of Us has some cool action moments, but The Last of Us also places a large emphasis on quiet moments too, and the tone of The Last of Us is pretty serious. Even when there's humor, it's all presented in a way that feels authentic to real life. Scenes that are meant to be serious and emotional actually feel serious and emotional. Like, take Sarah's death, which happens during the first 10 to 20 minutes of the game. Her death scene is one of the most emotional scenes I've ever seen in any game ever, even though I only just met these characters. So many games have character deaths that have no weight to them, and in some cases are actually funny.
Ah! No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What? What am I fighting for?
I talked earlier about how characters in most video games during the 6th and 7th generation of consoles didn't behave like real people. The Last of Us is the complete opposite of this. Characters interact with each other in a way that's very dynamic, realistic, and natural. Characters will cut each other off and they'll often communicate with each other non-verbally. Even something as simple as the blocking of the characters and their hand movements during conversations feel authentic to real life. And this is where the performances of the actors come in. The Last of Us has some of the best acting in any game I've played. The performances are genuinely amazing. amazing. I've already mentioned how David Hayter's performance as Solid Snake helped to enhance the character, but David Hayter was strictly doing voice acting. The Last of Us involved motion capture, which let the actors use more than just their voices when it came to their performances. Of course, The Last of Us wasn't the first game to have great acting, and great acting doesn't necessarily make a story good. It's just that the performances here really do add a lot to making the characters as great as they are. The performances give the characters a lot of personality. They help to make them so much more likable and relatable, and they help to make the characters feel like actual people. Both Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson have so much range, and they're able to convey so much as Joel and Ellie. It's amazing. I think their performances were a big reason as to why these characters were as interesting as they were. Something else I think helped the story were the visuals. I don't believe great visuals automatically make a story great. It's just that in The Last of Us's case, I do think the visuals help to improve the narrative. The Last of Us is set in a world that's been in shambles for 20 years, and yet you'll hear Ellie talk about the beauty of the world and what she's seeing. The backdrops, the environments, and the lighting absolutely help to convey these things to you. You really feel the harshness of the world you're in, but yet you also feel how beautiful this world really is. They help to set the tone for the journey that the characters are on. I've been mainly showing footage from the remake on PS5, but the original game had stunning visuals for its time that looked better than arguably any other game out on the PS3. And the original game's visuals were able to convey all the elements I just talked about. One thing from a visual component that I think is dramatically better in the remake is the faces. In the original game, faces express some emotions, but in the remake, faces express a lot more emotion. In the remake, you could see characters' emotions be strongly expressed, but you can also see them be subtly expressed too. And just by looking at a character's face in the remake, you could learn a good amount about what the characters are feeling at a certain moment. This is a form of storytelling that we come to expect from the best dramas like The Godfather or Good Will Hunting. Most games nowadays can't come close to reaching this form of storytelling. The fact that a game can capture all of this is amazing.
Is everything you were hoping for?
It's got its ups and downs, but you can't deny the view, though.
Amazing visuals and great acting aren't enough on their own to make a narrative work. It's the story that's being told that matters the most at the end of the day. Thankfully, The Last of Us has an amazing story. I mentioned earlier how The Last of Us was more grounded than other games out at the time. So many games had cool and iconic characters like Cloud Strife, or Master Chief, or Ezio Auditore di Firenze. The thing is, while those characters were compelling, either the stories they were in had insanely high stakes, to the point where the narratives no longer felt grounded, or the characters themselves were so cool that they no longer felt like normal people. Cloud Strife was and still is one of my favorite characters ever, but his story involved him trying to stop a guy who wanted to destroy the entire planet. The stakes were so high that they no longer felt like a conflict that a normal person would ever encounter. Master Chief is an iconic character, but he's also an insanely cool space soldier. I mean, look at this. The character didn't feel like a normal person. Ezio was normal enough, and his story took place in cities that actually existed, and it even involved actual historical figures too. Even a lot of the gameplay elements had a sense of realism to them. But I brought up Ezio because his story also involved a lot of science fiction concepts that made his story no longer a grounded one. The world of The Last of Us was a world firmly built with a sense of reality. Yes, it's technically a game that involved the humans getting infected by cordyceps and turning into basically zombies, but cordyceps are actually real, and in real life, cordyceps do actually infect a variety of insects, which makes the infected have a sense of authenticity to them that you don't see in a lot of TV shows, movies, or games that involve zombies. The world felt real, and the characters in The Last of Us felt believable because they were normal. Joel and Ellie weren't superheroes of capes, they didn't have cool laser guns, and heck, they weren't swashbuckling explorers of good hair. They were just normal people. Ellie holding the potential cure for mankind on paper sounds pretty cliche, but the game presented it all in a way that wasn't over the top or nonsensical, and I think part of what made it easy to buy is that the characters in The Last of Us behaved how people in real life would probably have behaved if an actual virus were to occur. When things get bad, when societies fall apart, people's morals change, and you find that people, even good people, can be capable of doing heinous and monstrous things. In The Last of Us, there isn't really a villain. There are characters who maybe are worse than other characters, but everyone in this world has done something something wrong. And yet, even in spite of the fact that no one is innocent, time and time again, The Last of Us, the same characters who can be violent and cruel, can also show true humanity and compassion. And sometimes it's their humanity that leads them to do bad things. It's all very fascinating and complex. The Last of Us's creative director and writer Neil Druckmann's writing philosophy is to have a simple story and complex characters.
Simple stories, complex characters. And yes, that's how it should be. I hate games that have all this extra exposition that's unnecessary, and I love exploring complex relationships. That's always what I strive for. What's the right amount of exposition, and how do you layer that exposition with some character revelation so it doesn't feel like just pure exposition? That's very difficult writing.
A lot of games prior to The Last of Us did have interesting characters that were layered. However, the stories those characters were in were often complicated, and they often had huge amounts of lore that could confuse players who weren't as hardcore. A lot of the best JRPG stories come to mind when I think about this. They had strong and interesting narratives, but those narratives also could get complicated. Final Fantasy X is a game that I think has a really strong story, but I won't lie and say that some elements of the narrative couldn't get a bit confusing. The Last of Us' story is very simple and easy to follow, which makes it very accessible for the average person to get into, but its characters are also complex, which gives the story a greater amount of depth, and I think that's what makes The Last of Us' story better than stories in other games that also might be simple and easy to follow. Joel is a perfect example of complex. At the very beginning of the game, you see him not as a hardened survivor, but as a father. During the intro of a game, you see him bond with his daughter, you see him show true love the way any normal father would, and then you see him lose his daughter and experience real grief and sorrow. A lot of stories in media would use main characters losing someone as means to make the main character become a hero. The Last of Us doesn't do this because Joel is no hero. He commits a lot of acts that would be considered morally reprehensible, and he could be a complete jerk. He could also be quite villainous at times. A lot of stories would actually use a tragic backstory like Joel's to make the character a villain, but Joel isn't a villain either. We never see him cross the line that a character like David crosses. Joel shows real empathy and love, and he has moments where he's extremely caring and warm. None of these moments are deceptive. They're genuine and honest. Joel's a man who just does what he needs to survive and to protect those he loves. And to do either of those things in the world of The Last of Us, sometimes you have to put ethics aside. Sometimes you have to become a monster.
Let me go.
You just come after her.
Joel's definitely a morally gray character, and it's debatable as to whether or not he's actually a good person, but regardless as to whether or not Joel's a good person, I think he's a fantastic multi-dimensional character. Ellie's also a brilliantly written and complicated character too. Ellie's more mature for someone her age. Unlike Joel, Ellie grew up after the outbreak happened. She's seen the cruelty of this world. Maybe not to the extent that Joel has, but like Joel, she's clearly been through her own traumatic life experiences. And because of that, Ellie has a rough personality. She can be very brash and impulsive. She curses frequently, and she can be quite aggressive.
What are you doing?
Bill, turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
Turn around.
All right.
And get on your knees. Don't test me. Just
Take it easy.
any bites. Oh, anything sprouting?
Oh, God damn it, I'm clean!
If I see so much as a twitch. Ow! Stop! Son of a bitch!
But yeah, she also has a big heart, and she shows genuine concern for others. She can be very funny, and she helps to lighten the mood throughout the game. She's incredibly caring, and she's still a kid. She has the same wonder that someone her age, maybe someone even younger than her age, would have. Ellie is a very nuanced character, which is part of what makes her so compelling to me. The Last of Us is about Joel's journey, but it's also about Ellie's journey too. Whereas Joel regains a lot of his humanity throughout the game, largely because of Ellie. Ellie loses a lot of her innocence. She had her fair amount of traumatic experiences before The Last of Us, but Ellie was still optimistic and had hope. Gradually over the course of the game, she goes through more tragic and heartbreaking experiences that make her more hardened, and by the end of the game, Ellie feels a bit more like Joel. These two characters on their own are absolutely amazing, but pairing them together gives them both so much more depth. I've seen games where characters bond and form relationships with each other, but truth be told, I can think of very few games that manage to do this as well as The Last of Us. I spent so much time seeing Ellie and Joel struggle to survive. I spent so much time seeing them go through heartbreaking experiences as as they, the characters, and I, the player, traveled across this harsh world. I saw Ellie and Joel lose people, but I also saw them high-five each other. I saw Ellie tell jokes and puns to Joel. I saw Joel get Ellie to pet a giraffe, and I watched the two as they looked out at the world in front of them. I, the player, saw all of these big and small moments between these two characters. These loud moments, but also these quiet moments too, where you really got to bond with them. This game does such an incredible job creating the bond between these two characters, and what's amazing is how much of their relationship is formed during gameplay and not cutscenes. During gameplay, Joel and Ellie will have casual conversations with each other. These conversations really help to make the characters feel more real and human. So much of their growth as characters happens during gameplay. It's also just so much more impactful when Joel and Ellie react to something that you, the player, can see in gameplay versus reacting to something that you see in a cutscene.
Ice cream truck?
Yeah, Henry told me about these. They sell ice cream out of the truck.
What? No way. Joel?
That's true. This thing drive around and play real loud, creepy music, and kids would come running out to buy ice cream.
You're totally fucking with me.
Serious.
Man, you lived in a strange time.
Even the ways you interact with the world help to flesh the characters out. Like, you can trigger optional conversations and interactions with Ellie by pressing the triangle button, which gives way to a lot of nice small moments like high-fiving Ellie.
Teamwork.
Or if you want to be mean, not high-fiving Ellie.
Teamwork.
In the game, you carry around ladders, and you also wait for Ellie to drop ladders down so you can climb them. It's used enough in the game to the point where when Ellie just drops the ladder down for you recklessly, you, the player, know something unusual is happening. And that just makes the whole draft scene so much more effective. It's just great storytelling. I think at its core, what makes The Last of Us' story so great is how it explores what it means to be human. Joel barely feels like a human at the beginning of the game. He hurts and kills all these people while being in this weird detached state. His life is just devoid of any meaning, but we get it because we saw him lose Sarah. You don't see Sarah being mentioned by name once after the opening until we get to this scene with Joel and Ellie, and yet you still feel Joel's pain from losing her throughout the game. Joel tries to deal with trauma by just burying it, trying to just not acknowledge it. When Tess dies and Ellie brings it up, he just shuts her down. When Tommy offers Joel an old picture of Sarah and him, he doesn't even take it. And the biggest of all, when Ellie brings up Sarah, you can see just how mad Joel gets.
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie? You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
But what's interesting is that Joel still has the watch that Sarah gave him back at the beginning of the game, and even early on in the game, you still see Joel act somewhat like a father. Joel tries to hold himself back from getting too attached to Ellie because in this world, getting attached to someone and caring for them just leads to more pain and suffering. But even with that, Joel still gets attached to her, and we get it. You spend so much time bonding with Ellie that you, the player, feel a connection to Ellie just like Joel does. That's why when you get to the end of the game and find out that in order to make a vaccine, Ellie is gonna have to die, you completely understand Joel's decision to save her even if you don't agree with it. He's already lost one daughter and has had to go through years of grief and emotional trauma, and now just when he's finally recovered, he has to lose his new daughter. Obviously, he's not just gonna let Ellie die. Maybe letting Ellie die so that a vaccine that could potentially save everyone can be made is the right choice, but Joel made the human choice, which is to save the person he cared most about, even if it meant that everyone else was potentially gonna have to suffer because of that. It's a really complicated question as to whether or not Joel made the right choice, but things get even more complicated when Joel straight up lies to Ellie.
Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
When Joel lies to Ellie in this scene, the look he gives her makes it seem like he has zero doubts about what he's saying, but yet it seems like Ellie doesn't entirely believe him, or does she? This scene and the ending as a whole pose so many interesting questions, like, did Ellie believe Joel? Is Ellie forcing herself to believe in him? Does she know deep down that Joel lied to her but just doesn't want to deal with the truth? Was Joel right in lying to Ellie? Did Joel do the right thing by saving her from that hospital? Could a cure or a vaccine have been made if the surgery happened? Would society recover or even if a cure or vaccine was made. There's so much discussion that has been had about the ending and that still can be had about the ending, I think, for years to come. At the end of the game, one of the things that struck me is that even though Joel might be a bit conflicted about what he did, he still feels whole. He saved the person that he cared for the most and now he can finally live again. Ellie's arc feels almost like the inverse of Joel's. Joel found a reason to live which made him feel whole again. Ellie was relatively whole. She was confident because she had a mission that gave her life meaning. She was potentially gonna save everyone. But because Joel told her there was no cure, her reason for fighting was gone. Her reason for carrying on was gone. And the hope that something better was coming is gone too. Ellie's the character that feels like her life no longer has any meaning. The ending and the game in general managed to pose so many moral questions and dilemmas, and in a way that feels completely earned and believable because the writing is just so good. This is honestly one of the greatest endings I've ever seen in a game. No, not just a game, it's one of the greatest endings I've seen in any piece of media ever. The way the visuals, gameplay, music, and story all come together here is nothing short of masterful. Earlier in the video, I talked about my theory about how for people who are casual gamers or not gamers at all, stories from old games from the SNES or PS1 era didn't feel like legitimate forms of storytelling due to the games those stories were in not resembling reality. I think The Last of Us is one of, if not the first game to completely break this. Characters looked like people, but more than most games from the 6th and 7th generation consoles, they actually acted and behaved like people. This was the game that really showed a lot of people that games can tell legitimately great stories. Not great video game stories, just great stories. I've heard from some people over the years that The Last of Us is just an interactive movie, a game that just could have been a movie or TV show, as if there's no value in this narrative being presented in a game. To me, this is kind of fascinating because now The Last of Us has been turned into a TV show. You can experience the general story without ever playing the game. And, well, I have to say that watching the show really proved to me why The Last of Us' story is actually enhanced by being a game. This isn't a rant about the show, by the way, because I actually really like the TV show and think that it did a great job adapting the story, and I do think it's a good show just in general, but in my opinion, I think the story worked better in the game. Part of it did have to do with the fact that the game was longer than the TV show, which made it easier to develop Joel and Ellie and their relationship. The Last of Us only had 9 episodes. One of them largely focused on characters who weren't Joel and Ellie, and another episode focused on the Left Behind DLC, not to mention the focus on characters like Kathleen who really weren't that important to the story. So there wasn't really as much time to develop the relationship between Joel and Ellie, but to me there was something else about the game that made its story more impactful to me than the show's, in my opinion. The story is something you experience by looking around at the environments. You experience the story by seeing random NPCs just interact with each other and live out their lives. You experience the story by exploring old houses and reading notes from people and getting to see their story in this world. You experience the story of The Last of Us in so many more ways in comparison to a show. In the game, very often you decide what you want to see and how you want to see it. In the show, the things you see are chosen for you, and how you see those things are shown to you in a specific way by the filmmakers. And in the TV show, it feels like you're just watching the characters experience these things, but in the game, it feels like you're the one experiencing them alongside Joel and Ellie. I don't think this makes the TV show bad at all. It's just that I feel like the game presented the story in a way that felt more immersive and engrossing. The Last of Us may be cinematic like a movie or TV show, but just like a game like BioShock, the story of the world you're in is one that you, the player, get by observing it and just taking it in for yourself. The idea that The Last of Us is just an interactive movie discredits the value in using the video game medium to tell its story, and how it manages to use the medium to enhance the story. It used the video game medium to give you an experience, and isn't that what the best games do? Give you experiences that you won't forget?
Get out of here, Joel!
What are you so afraid of? Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
The Last of Us managed to work gameplay and story together in a way that was so seamless and that almost no game prior to it was able to do. And it started a trend in video game stories that I'm really happy about, and that's the prioritization of characters over plot. Think about how much you connected with Kratos in the new God of War games, or Arthur Morgan in Red Dead Redemption 2. These multi-layered characters that you can analyze for days on end. The Last of Us paved the way for all of that. The Last of Us is absolutely one of the most impactful games ever made, but does that mean it has the best video game story ever? Does its story somehow eclipse every other video game story ever told? No. There are plenty of other incredible video game stories that came out before and after The Last of Us. Those stories were just as powerful and well told. I've seen some people act as if The Last of Us had the first ever amazing video game story, and to me this has always been kind of ridiculous. I've already mentioned some of the best narrative-focused games that came out prior to The Last of Us. The Last of Us could be argued had a video game story that resembled an Oscar-worthy drama film the most. I would honestly probably agree with that too. Lots of the best story-focused games had engaging and impressive narratives, but they also had moments like this that made it hard for people who weren't gamers to take them seriously. The Last of Us' story was more grounded than most other video game stories out at the time, but many of the best video game stories that came out prior to The Last of Us managed to be extremely powerful and touched on very mature ideas even if they were less grounded. Those narratives deserve to be held in as high regard as The Last of Us. And after The Last of Us came out, we saw an increase in video game stories that were grounded and mature in the same way that The Last of Us was. Those narratives were just as thematically rich and as powerful as The Last of Us. And so no, The Last of Us does not have the single greatest video game story ever told. With that being said, does that mean The Last of Us' story isn't amazing? No, because I still believe The Last of Us has an incredible story that's extremely moving and powerful. Joel and Ellie are two of the best characters I've ever seen in a video game, and their relationship is so beautifully well done. The game manages to cover a lot of extremely mature ideas and themes. It manages to portray its story with the same level of nuance and depth that we come to expect from the best drama films. The world is extremely captivating, and the narrative is one that will stay with you long after you finished it. I already knew The Last of Us' story was amazing, but actually taking the time to think deeply about The Last of Us has shown me just how incredible this narrative really was, just how nuanced and complex the characters in this game are. It's given me so much appreciation for this incredible narrative. The Last of Us doesn't have the best story ever told in the game, but it definitely has one of the best stories ever told in the game, and I think that counts for something. It's pretty exciting to see new fans discovering the show and the games. I can't wait to see what more there is from this universe. But anyways, those were only my thoughts. Things I said in this video are just from my opinion. Do you agree with me with what I said about The Last of Us' story? Comment below and let me know. And I want to leave you with this scene. If you've played a sequel, you know this scene hits hard. Thanks for watching.
Have a good night.
How is it that you're never scared?
Who says that I'm not?
What are you scared of?
Let's see. Scorpions are pretty creepy. Being by myself. I'm scared of ending up alone.